So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to our guest speaker tonight. We're delighted to have Kay Caball joining us for this lecture tonight. And Kay is a native of Listowel. Her previous publications are The Kerry Girls, Immigration and the Earl Grey Scheme, which was published in 2014, and Finding Your Ancestors in Kerry, published in 2015. Kay has contributed to several local history publications, including Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society Journal. Her research on the Earl Grey Famine Orphan Scheme was featured on the RTE History Show, the Irish Times, Radio Kerry, and the TG Cahir documentary Parawalya. Kay studied genealogy and family history at the University of Limerick. She is one of the team at Ancestors Network, and as a professional genealogist, she researches and blogs through mykerryancestors.com. Now, in 2018, Kay delivered a lecture for Kerry Writers Museum entitled Sinn Féin Food Committee versus the Earl of Listowel, to mark the centenary of the events at that time. And we're delighted to welcome her back tonight to deliver this lecture on the fall of the Fitzmaurices, the demise of Kerry's first family, based on her 2020 publication of the same title. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you. Kay.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Now, when we did recording, something went wrong with my, see the way that this side is up and it shouldn't, so just give me a moment to try to get this down.
Great, record away.
Resume the slideshow, yeah, okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to listen to this story. I've seen familiar names coming in and those that I don't know, but whoever and wherever you came from, you're very welcome, and I hope that I can do this story of the Fitzmaurices. I hope I can do them proud. Probably most of you have an interest in them and know something about them. But this is a true story. It's not alone is it just a story, it's the true story, and sometimes people don't really believe it. They think it's a kind of a romantic fairy tale that I made up out of the top of my head. But it's the true story of one of the most powerful families in Kerry. So for over 500 years, they were the premier family in the county. And then within a very short space of 100 years, they lost everything. They lost their titles, their land, and their money. And more importantly, I suppose, they lost their lineage. It died out. So what we're going to talk about today is about the three last Earls, because it was through them and through what each of them did or didn't do that the whole line of the Fitzmaurices died out. And this, in my view, which I'll come to at the end, was very significant for the people of particularly of North Kerry. So the Fitzmaurices themselves arrived in Ireland with the Normans, and they established a base in North Kerry in the mid-13th century. The first one was Thomas Fitzmaurice, and you'll see as we go along, it can get quite confusing because they have names that kind of repeated again and again, but our three have different names, so we should be okay. But the first one was a Thomas Fitzmaurice, and he'd got a title when he arrived, and he was titled the Lord of Kerry. Now, you might ask what that was, but it was the equivalent then to a Gaelic chieftain. The Fitzmaurices were original great survivors, because for all the centuries, it wasn't all success and it wasn't all good stories as they went along. Because for all of that time, they held on to their lands in Kerry by a combination of conquest, land acquisition, advantageous marriages, and when needed, shifting religious loyalties. They had conflicts on their own territory, principally with the Fitzgeralds of Desmond and with the O'Connors of Carrigafoyle. And outside of those, over the years, they had survived revolts against Queen Elizabeth I, on the two Desmond rebellions, against Cromwell, and in the end against the Jacobite War. In this time, the Fitzmaurices were transformed from what was essentially warlords, who were effective rulers over the lands that they owned, and they were then became regular landlords as we know them. In all, there were 23 Lords of Kerry, and also called Barons of Leixna. That was their title, Lord of Kerry, Baron of Leixna. And the final three of these 23 were then elevated and given the title of Earl. And these are the ones that we're going to talk about. And it was then that the line died out. I'm going to show you who these are now. So the three that we're going to talk about are Thomas, up here at the top, but I don't have a picture of him because there just are no pictures available of him. And this is a painting of his wife, Anne Petty. In the middle, we have William, the second Earl, and then we have Francis, the third Earl. The time that we're talking about, just to put it is the time of the Treaty of Limerick. And as you probably all remember from your school days, this was in October 1691. Thomas Fitzmaurice, whom we're going to talk about, who married Anne Petty, he married in 1692. But we're going to start with this time, 1691, because when I started this, I found this very unusual, but I think maybe that I was kind of looking at it simplistically. The Fitzmaurices at this point were Protestants and had been Protestants for quite a number of years. But at 1691, the then Lord of Kerry, William was his name, and his son Thomas, the man that we're going to be interested in, they took the side of James, not the side of the Williamites. And that was kind of unusual. You'd have to question their loyalty, because the Kerry families who took part in the Williamite wars and the ones who fought on the Jacobite side, you know, they divided as to whether they were Catholics or Protestants on the ground. So, for instance, the Williamites were the new Kerry Protestant undertakers, the Blennerhassetts, the Collises, the Hillards, the Ponsonbys. These are just some of the names. And those that fought for Catholic King James were the old Gaelic and Norman Irish, the Fitzgeralds, the Browns of Killarney, the Rices, the Cantillans, the McGillicuddies, and the Trants. Now, the Fitzmaurices could identify with both of them because they were an older family than any of them, but they were also Protestants at this stage. But we now find that they sided with King James, unusually, and when he was beaten at the Battle of the Boyne, the descendants of the Fitzmaurices, who were the petty Fitzmaurices in England, they believed that William and his son Thomas, the man we're going to talk about, they actually, after the defeat, they left with King James and they fled to France. Now, what I can't understand is that after the Treaty of Limerick, which was, as I said, was in October 1691, Thomas Fitzmaurice married Anne Petty, and we'll go back up here again so you'll see them. He married Anne Petty in 1692, and you might ask who was Anne Petty. She was the only daughter of Sir William Petty, and I don't think I have to introduce William Petty to too many people, but for those who might not know at all, who come from abroad, he worked in Cray, was an officer in Cromwell's army. He surveyed and he mapped all the land to be forfeited by Catholics, and those that were to be redistributed to the Protestant adventurers and the English soldiers. Petty himself had left home with 4 sixpence, but he was paid £18,000. Now, this would be in the days of 1650. He was paid €18,000 to produce the Down Survey, which was the basis of land title for over half of Ireland. Because he was one of those in charge of allocating the land, he bought claims himself at a quarter of their true value, and he amassed 270,000 acres in South Kerry alone. So this was a remarkable marriage, the marriage, in my view, between Thomas and Anne. But I began to think about it and I looked at all angles, and basically what it was really was, it was a strategic alliance. It was, I suppose, what the Fitzmaurices had been doing for the previous hundreds of years, marrying strategically. So what did each person get from it? You'd have to ask that first. The Pettys had new money and plenty of it. The Fitzmaurices didn't have a lot of money, but the Fitzmaurices were aristocratic and they were regarded as an old Irish family. So what really happened was all political loyalties were put aside, and it just was a strategic alliance when they married. Now, the marriage settlement, which was obviously something important when a marriage was being arranged between them, the marriage settlement was £10,000, which actually in today's euros would be 2,371,000. Now, only 4,000 of the original 10,000 was cash. The rest was tied up in investments and marriage settlements for future offspring. Now, so Thomas and Anne had 8 children actually, but 5 survived. So the first one was William, who became the second Earl of Kerry. And he's the next person we're going to talk about once we have dealt with the father, Thomas. They had daughters, Lady Anne. She married Sir Maurice Crosby, a neighbour in Ardfert. A daughter, Lady Arabella, who married Colonel Arthur Denny, another neighbour. He was an MP in Tralee. And Lady Charlotte, who married in County Cork. I think it might have been Macroom, I'm not certain about that, married Sir Charles Colthurst. And the second son in that family was called John Fitzmaurice. He was the younger son, and he was always Thomas's favourite son. He later inherited the petty estates, and I will explain that to you, and he became the Earl of Shelburne. So we'll just leave him for the moment because it's easy to get mixed up with all of these. Now, Thomas, who married Anne Petty, when they got married, they went to live in what was then a mansion house, the Fitzmaurice mansion house in Lexna. We are going to call it the Old Court, because as soon as they got married, they just started to throw money in a big way and to throw everything that they had into getting that house sorted and getting it into a palatial mansion. He concentrated, Thomas himself, his time and his energy, and as we'll see, a vast amount of money on transforming the Fitzmaurice ancestral seat and the house and surrounding domain into a magnificent and impressive manorial estate. Lady Anne had been used to living in London, and she lived in some splendour in the Petty household in Sackville Street in Piccadilly. So she set to modernising and embellishing the inside and the basic structure of the house. Thomas focused his attention on the grounds, and he created a stunning landscape there with a formal parkland, a deer park, bowling green, canals, avenues, wall gardens, orchards and plantations. In the house itself, there were staterooms, there was a ballroom and a private family chapel. Now, some of these, because I have been so many times now to the Old Court myself, what remains of it in Lexna, some of these are still visible in Lexna, or you can see where they had been. So I'm not going to talk much about the actual house because I'm concentrating on the lives of the three men. And a lot of this I would recommend Dr. John Knightley has a brilliant explanation of this in the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Journal. I'll give you the dates and number of that afterwards. I'm just going to read a little bit that he says here. It was here in the Old Court that Thomas and Anne, supported by a staff of over 47 servants, entertained the other prominent families of Kerry and the surrounding countryside. The principal Kerry families, now they were mixed. They were native Irish, Old English and New English. They had intermarried over the years, and a lot of the times they were feuding with each other, and then sometimes they would be aligning each other if it suited them, you know, for political or social purposes. So I hope I have given you some vision now of what it was like, of where they were living and the palatial style in which they were living. Thomas himself was ennobled as an Earl in 1722. And at that point, he acquired a townhouse. So he was no longer now just the Lord of Kerry and Baron of Lexna. He was now the first Earl of Kerry. They acquired a Dublin townhouse because this is what you do when you're made an Earl, you start to go up in the world. And it was called Kerry House. It was in St. Stephen's Green. It's not exactly on exactly where the Shelburne was, but it was some of that ground, plus the ground that you can see at the side. It's now Kildare Street, and that's where Kerry House was. Miss Anne Petty's brother, who was at that point, his title was the Earl of Shelburne. The Pettys had got the titles of Shelburne for the amount of work that the father had done, Sir William Petty had done. So Henry Petty, her brother, also had a house there, but was further along the same street as you go towards Grafton Street. Now, Thomas had a well-deserved reputation for domineering his own family and his servants, and he terrorised, it says, the neighbouring countryside. His grandson, William Petty Fitzmaurice, and I'll be explaining to you who this was. His grandson would have been John's son, the younger son's son of the younger son. His grandson, William Petty Fitzmaurice, was brought up in Lexna until he was about 5 years of age. He became the second Earl of Shelburne, and he was later Prime Minister of Great Britain. He has left us a most unflattering picture of his grandfather. He said, "My grandfather did not want the manners of the country nor the habits of his family to make him a tyrant. He was so by nature. He was the most severe character which can be imagined, obstinate and inflexible. He had much understanding, but strong nerves and great perseverance. He had no education except what he had in the army, where he served in his youth, with a good degree of reputation for personal bravery and activity. His children did not love him, but they dreaded him. His servants the same. He was obviously, from listening to him, and then as we go along with the story, you can just get the picture that he was obviously irascible, and like those after him, he was all the time involved in litigation with both his friends and foes. However, having said all that, the family were very forward thinking. You know, while they were adorning the estate and the domain around the old court, they were improving the local landscape, and they were improving the tenant farms, draining the marshes, building canals, and they're planting a lot of woods and orchards. And this provided much needed employment in the locality. Lady Anne, on the other hand, seemed to have a totally different kind of person. She was the only person who could manage her husband, really. She was reputed to be an intelligent lady and a strong character in her own right. Now, she had many influential friends, and letters remain that she had written to them, and they writing back to her. And she corresponded with them, and she met them both in Dublin and London. From what we can see, she continued coming backwards and forth to London. For instance, she wrote to Dean Swift and Horace Walpole, and in turn they were writing to her. Dean Swift himself says that he had struck a mighty friendship with her, but unfortunately he says then that she was egregiously ugly, but was perfectly well bred. So I suppose we should take that on board. Yeah. So we're going to go to William. William was never his father's favourite. He was the second Earl. He hasn't succeeded to the title yet. I just want to show you him in the photograph. He was never his father's favourite. In fact, he disappointed his father. As I said, it was John, the younger son, whom he favoured. Now, William had a privileged upbringing. He was tutored at home first, and then at Eton and Oxford. His mother, Lady Anne, she was obviously ambitious for her eldest son, and such an expensive education at Eton, as I said, and later Oxford, I think it would not have been seen as essential for a successful career as a Kerry peer and a member of the Irish Parliament. I think she obviously had greater ambitions for him, and those ambitions were probably in the British Parliament. We must kind of remember that she was the only daughter of Sir William Petty, and he had served under Oliver Cromwell, he had served under Charles II and James II. So the Petty family were, you know, they had politically minded, they were adept at keeping in favour with the leading politicians of the day. They were able to twist around and go with each different, whatever side needed to be on at the time. And in my opinion, she expected that William would be an influential figure in British public life, and that's why he got such an expensive education. However, after he went to Oxford, but he neglected his studies. And he left Oxford, and then he got a notion that life in the army would suit him better. Now, his father reluctantly paid £3,000 for a commission in the Coldstream Guards. And, you know, when I give you the prices and the costs, these are all back in 1700, so you can imagine what they would be now. He went to the Coldstream Guards, but when the father agreed to give him this 3,000, which was quite a hefty sum, the father drew up a deed. I think he was getting a bit doubtful about William, and he drew up a deed making an approved provision for John and his sisters, like giving them more money from the family fortunes and giving less, if you like, to William. And what he sneaked into this deed was that should William marry without his father's consent, his future wife would forfeit any jointure of £500, which was the usual that time that you would give to a wife. This jointure was a sum of money for herself. It wasn't always for herself, because often her husband had control of it anyway, but it was something that would be marked down for her. As I said, he went to the Coldstream Guards, and he actually gained the rank of colonel, so he can't have been, you know, totally useless. But he quickly took up his life gambling, wenching and carousing. And I'd like to thank John Knightley for the phrase wenching, which I think is a very good way of explaining the way William went on in life. So he took up gambling, wenching and carousing. Now, when he came back from the Coldstream Guards, he was appointed governor of Ross Castle, and that was in Killarney. They were the military headquarters in Kerry at the time. He didn't spend very long in Lexna at any time. He visited the townhouse in Dublin for the season. Obviously, whenever the season was the parliamentary season in Dublin, and that's where there was a really lively social life. Dublin, which we can remember, is the second city of the empire at that time. And that's where he would meet the cream of social life, dinner parties, races, the opera, theatre, and gambling. So as I said, I have here his Miriam. In 1724, he met Elizabeth Leeson. Now, she was a widow and she lived in Fishamble Street in Dublin. And if we remember, Fishamble Street was where Handel's Messiah was first, and it's around the same time where Handel's Messiah was first performed. Now, they had a 2-year affair, and one child was born of the union, not mentioned anymore. That was just the way it was then. He saw Elizabeth as his mistress, and she wouldn't have been the only one, as we discovered later when he made his will. However, Elizabeth saw William as a potential husband, and his wealth and importance on the Dublin social scene made him even more attractive. His mother, Lady Kerry, and his father back in Lexna were anxious to see him make a dynastic marriage to a suitable bride and then to produce heirs. And Elizabeth Leeson was not the person they had in mind. So the affair went along for a couple of years, and then one day Elizabeth declared publicly that she and William were married. This is at this time Elizabeth is writing to Lady Kerry, but she's saying to Lady Kerry, writing letters to Lexna, that no, they're not, that it's not serious and that she wouldn't cause them any trouble. And she was just kind of, whether William had got around to write this letter or not, I don't know, but it would appear that Lady Kerry had got wind of rumours, as they used to call it. As we go along with this story through the 3 Earls, you'll find that rumours have a lot to play with a lot of things. So social media that we have now is something like the rumours that were then. So rumours began to come out that they were married, and she's telling Lady Elizabeth Leeson is writing to Lady Kerry, and she's saying to her, no, not at all, they're not married at all, we're just friends. But suddenly she made the public announcement that they were married, and what she claimed was that she and William, on 3 separate occasions during the season, that on 3 separate occasions they had said to each other, we swear we will never marry another, and we will never marry anyone else during our joint lives. And on the 3rd occasion, Elizabeth claimed that they had made this statement to each other over a copy of the Book of Common Prayer, and they had an independent witness. The witness was Elizabeth Vickers, the kitchen maid. There was an initial court case, and it was lodged in the consistory court of the Archbishop of Dublin. When I was reading the wording and I was reading the evidence that was given, it struck me that, and I suppose maybe it's kind of a suspicious striking, that Elizabeth Vickers was a handy person to have, she was able to go in and swear in court that she heard them say this. So the initial court case was lodged in the consistory court of the Archbishop of Dublin, and it went against Elizabeth. She lost it. But she appealed to the Court of Chancery in London, and they reversed the Irish decision. The marriage was declared a valid contract. So without any church or state being present or have anything to do with it, it was decreed that William Fitzmaurice was married, and he should now perform a ceremony of marriage. It was called infacia ecclesia, meaning in a church, within a given time, or he would be excommunicated. Well, you can imagine what happened in Lexna. All hell broke loose in Lexna. He was unable to marry anyone else. He didn't go ahead with the church wedding, but he disappeared, as he was wanted to do and had done already. He went to France, emigrated to France, and kind of holed up there, stayed away from Lexna. His father was incandescent with rage. His mother died a few years later. Really, she probably had never got over it. And he was still in France and stayed there until he had, what we probably have to say uncharitably, had a stroke of luck. because Elizabeth, she was now called Lady Elizabeth Kerry, but Elizabeth Leeson died in 1735. So now he was free to marry again. And he then married Lady Gertrude Lambert. That was in 1738. She was the daughter of the 4th Earl of Cavan. As his mother had died, his mother always seemed to be the one down in Lexna who was trying to sort out the rest of the children with the father, or to plead for them, or to try to take their, their side, and to get everybody talking together. But his mother has died at this stage, and his father withdrew his approval for the marriage. And because of the deed they had sworn earlier times, this meant that there was now an issue with the family settlement and wills. And because he regarded the Lamberts as a weak family, it meant that William's wife, Lady Gertrude Lambert, was not going to get any jointure because the father had knocked that out earlier on. Now, they had 2 children. William and Lady Elizabeth Lambert had 2 children. They had Francis, who was born in Dublin in 1740, and Anna Margaretta, who was born in Ardfert, with their relations at the Crosbys in Ardfert, was born in 1741. Now, she later married Maurice Fitzgerald, the 16th Knight of Kerry, and they lived in Dingle, in the Grove in Dingle. This is Francis, and just keep him in mind, because he's the principal person that we're going to be talking to, who actually was the person who spent most of the money. So he was born, and as I said, in 1740. His mother and father, William and his mother, they lived in Molesworth Street. Remember that the Fitzmaurice family home was at the top of Stephen's Green. So they had to get their own house, and they went around the corner and they went to Molesworth Street. And it's actually obviously not that house, but on that land. I think that's Savills, the auctioneers at the moment. But this was a kind of a prestigious residence. This was a new street, Molesworth Street, and it was wont to be a very fashionable street. In fact, they weren't long there when another lord built at the top of the street. The Duke of Leinster built his house, the one that we now know as Leinster House or Dáil Éireann. So the Fitzmaurices were there before that, and then Leinster House was built. Thomas, the father, died in 1741. It just said last week he died at his seat in Lexna in the county of Kerry, the most noble, and I don't know how to, I can't read it in English, Lord Thomas Fitzmaurice, Earl of Kerry, Viscount Clanmorris, and one of His Majesty's the Privy Council of Ireland, and he was succeeded by his eldest son. So now we have William has got, he's got his power. He is going to be the 2nd Earl of Kerry, and he is going to revel in that. In the meantime, this is the monument in Lexna, and the reason I'm showing you this is that Thomas, the 1st Earl, had built this for his wife, and Petty had been buried in Kiltomey, but he built this himself because he wanted to be buried there. And even on his deathbed, and his will and everything, he had asked the people he left behind, his children, to make certain to bury him here. However, for whatever reason, they didn't do it. He was taken to Kiltomey as well. And then we had the monument here in Lexna until it was knocked down. Now, this is, William Fitzmaurice only lasted 7 years. And go back here again. He only lasted 7 years. He didn't have much time really to do a lot. He kept the place in Lexna. He kept the old court going. He managed the rents. He did almost everything properly. But he seemed to have had bad health, and within 7 years he had died. He was buried then in the monument, and that's significant later. So his was the only body that was buried there. In the meantime, Francis, the people living in Molesworth Street, which is his wife, Francis and Margaretta, are living there. So nobody is come to Lexna because Lady Kerry, the second Lady Kerry Lambert, because she was disliked, we'll say, by her father-in-law. She didn't have much time really for Lixna or for the Old Court, and she didn't come there very often. She's now the owner, if you like, or the custodian of the Old Court when her husband died. I think he was about 55. But she really she wasn't really keen on it at all, and she wanted to stay in Molesworth Street. So she just packed up. She took out any of the very good furniture, took it for herself or gave it to some of the family, and some of the paintings were given out to the aunts and to the different people, but they left a housekeeper in charge of it. And she was in where she wanted to be, which was in Molesworth Street, with the 2 children. But very soon after, maybe about 3 years after her husband died, she met another person and she married the other person. I'll just get my notes now. When William died, he stipulated that his wife, Lady Gertrude, would be the guardian of his children until and unless she remarried. She was responsible for the income of the estate and for the education of their son, Francis Thomas, who had now inherited and was the 3rd Earl. However, Gertrude remarried in 1750 and she went to live in England, leaving Francis and Margaretta in the house in Molesworth Street, and they were put in the charge. Well, the Lord Chancellor, legally the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, acted as Francis's guardian, but in reality it would have been his tutor, Reverend Dudley Reeves, who looked after him. So both of these 2 were in this house. Really, they had uncaring parents for a start before the father died and before the mother got married and took off, and the servants were just kind of left to look after them. So when you see how they ended up, you really have to keep that in mind as well. Almost immediately after William died and Francis took over, and he's only 7 years of age, the court, one of the many court cases that they were going on all of the time, one of them started, and it was his uncle John. And again, it was going back to the previous settlements and deeds and who got what portions they got. Some people thought they didn't get enough. And this Uncle John went to law against him. Now, Francis, obviously 7 years of age, wasn't able to defend that, but the Lord Chancellor defended it on his behalf. They lost it. Francis lost it. They appealed it and they lost it again. So John got the amount of money that he was looking for. He had then a great stroke of luck, because the following year, his mother's brother, his uncles, died, and he inherited their title and their land. But he had to do it, he got all that on the proviso that he wouldn't just be Fitzmaurice, he would call himself Petty Fitzmaurice, to keep the name Petty in it as well. So he became the Earl of Shelburne, and he had vast property and estates in Ireland and in England. And John and his wife and son moved to Bowood in Wiltshire, and it was their son William that became the Prime Minister of England, and I will get to that. So Francis himself was, as I said, it was with Dudley Reeves. He can't have been too bad, Dudley Reeves, because he got him to Trinity, and he left there with a BA and an MA in 1759. I'll just say, bring in here that he was the second Fitzmaurice to graduate from Trinity. Patrick, the 19th Lord, he had matriculated from Trinity as well in 1613. And he was the hostage when the Listowel Castle was taken, and he was the hostage who had been taken out of the Listowel Castle. He had been sent to England, and he had adapted to the Protestant faith. He was the first Protestant Fitzmaurice. At this point, the old court was deserted. The valuable contents of the house were removed. The furniture, paintings, and silver were taken, and Listowel was closed up, as I said, except for a housekeeper. Now, at this point, Charles Smith, who was written his book, The Present and Ancient State of the County Kerry, went on a visit to Kerry, and he reported, and I'll read a couple of things out of that, of what the state was like in Listowel. He said that this sea stands agreeably on the river Brick, which is here cut into several pleasant canals that adorns its plantations and gardens. The improvements are very extensive. Most of the vistas and avenues terminating by different buildings, seats and farmhouses. The tide flows up to the gardens, whereby boats of a considerable burden may bring up goods to the bridge near the house. Here are 2 stone bridges over the Brick, the eldest of which was built by Nicholas III, Baron of Lexna. The present house consists of a large building with wings on each side and several offices that enclose handsome area, and one of these wings is a chapel. Smith also reported at that time that the village of Lexna consists of 1 street of tolerable good houses, not far to the east of which is a noble avenue of lofty fir trees, terminated by the monument, whereon is erected a monumental tower, beneath which in a vault the late Earl of Kerry is interred. So Francis is, as I said, growing up in Dublin. He makes some visits, but not very many, to Kerry, and he goes to stay with his aunt again in Ardfert, in the Crosby household. He reached his majority in 1761. Now, he had the benefits of it, but he also had the responsibilities of a large estate and a substantial income. He had no interest in going to live in Exile. He had much loftier ideas than that. He proceeded to have the type of life other young aristocrats of the time had. He went on the grand tour. He enjoyed all the amusements that Dublin had to offer, which was, as I said, the centre of the Anglo-Irish social world. And he was someone with a large income. And he soon acquired, because he was able to spend and do what he really had. He was free to do whatever he wanted. He acquired a London residence. And 2 years later, when he was 22 years of age, he was the father of a son, Francis Dudley, called Francis Dudley Fitzmaurice. Now, he gave him his name, he obviously wasn't married to the mother of Francis, but there was no worries, it's the way they did it. He settled an annuity of £300 a year on the child, and the same amount on the mother, Elizabeth Chambers, who was an actress, and she would get that for the duration of her life. When he settled these sums on them, they had to be paid out of some place, and they were to be payable out of rents of named townlands. And in this case, Bale, Kilconnelly, Listowel, and Drumlagach. As far as he was concerned, and as far as the people that he knew, the other aristocrats, he had fulfilled his moral duty, and there was no approbation for anyone from his social set. It's quite normal behaviour for the nobility at that time. He was the target of many aristocratic mothers, as you can imagine, hoping to get their daughters well placed in marriage. But I'm afraid it wasn't to be. Francis, unfortunately, and he's young now, he's 23, I think, 24. He met a lady called Anastasia Daly, and he met her obviously in the social scene in Dublin. They knew each other from 1763 onwards. We have no birth date for Anastasia, but his family, the Fitzmaurices, who obviously didn't like the situation at all, his family believed she was 20 years older than him. And not alone was she 20 years older than him, she was a Catholic from Galway, and she was already married. She was married to Charles Daly, same name. He was a cousin of hers, actually, a member of the Irish House of Commons. I suppose the positive things about her was she was also an heiress in her own right. She had £500 a year to herself, and I make that distinction, which is important later. I think I said earlier, because you had money, it didn't mean you had to go on and do what you liked with it. If your husband didn't like what you were doing with it, you mightn't be able to spend it. But her father left this to her in her own right, and in fact, he left her land as well. And when he died, and when she got the land, she actually conformed to Protestantism so that she could hold on to the land. But as we go along, she kind of was, she was 1 minute a Catholic and the next minute a Protestant. She kind of worked it whatever way she felt it would go best for her. She was well placed. She had 2 sisters. They were well off. One was married to the Viscount Kingsland and the other to the Earl of Louth. They were pretty well connected. What happened next? Now, we had to glean, it wasn't because somebody wrote about it or that somebody came and told us about it. We had to glean it from court cases. So it was a court case taken by Charles Daly Anastasia's husband, against the Earl of Francis for criminal conversation of his wife. He took an action against her, and what I will tell you was he explained why he was taking the action. And at that time, you were kind of, as I mentioned, you were owned by your wife, and Anastasia and her husband were, that's why he was able to go for criminal conversation. He had lost kind of her companionship and anything else that he might get from her, so he was going to take an action about it. Anastasia and her husband had been leasing a house in Clare Street for the season. They did that every year for the parliamentary season. This was only around the corner from Molesworth Street. And when the season was over, Anastasia had at this point met Francis, and she decided to stay put and not return to the Daly family home in Loughrea. She cited doctor's advice. The doctor once said to her that she should stay she should stay in Dublin near him. So what we gather from there was that they started, and this what came out on the court case later, was that they began to see each other, and there in the court case we had servants of both Daly, who took the action, and of the Earl, whose the action was against. And their servants went in and they swore what they had seen, and different, and of course they were swelling different things to what each other were saying, but each person was saying what their boss wanted them to say. There was the Right Honourable Francis Thomas Fitzgerald, commonly called the Earl of Kerry, this is what the court case says, became acquainted with Anastasia Daly, his wife. The Earl paid her great attention. He was observed to be always near her at public places and to take particular notice of her. And the said Anastasia Daly was seduced by the said Earl of Kerry to withdraw her duty and affection from her husband and to hold a criminal conversation with him. There was a fairly racy court case, and there was lots of talk about when they were giving evidence about what time each one visited the other, how many times in the day the Earl called to see Anastasia. He came and visited her at breakfast time. There was kind of insinuations in that. And then you had the final announcement by a housemaid. They had been, the drawing rooms were upstairs in all these houses, and they had been told, the servants, not to go up unless it was, there was something really seriously wrong. But this day a housemaid had gone up to take out the ashes, and she heard footsteps on the stairs, and she was in fear of what retribution would come to her for being there. She went behind one of the couches. So she was the main witness really, and she gave grand evidence that really got Charles Daly to win the case. She said there were lots of stories about petticoats being lifted and breeches go falling down, and later Anastasia going to the looking glasses, they called it, and settling her clothes and fixing her cap to rights. So he won the case, and Charles Daly, before his other evidence was that she was refusing, Anastasia, when he would call around, she was refusing to admit her to his bed, supportedly on the advice of Dr. Smith. Rumours again were swirling around, that's how I heard it. So the same rumours that had been there previously for the father. And he travelled to Clare Street and he insisted that she return home with him. And when your husband at that time insisted you returned home, you went. So she returned to Loughrea with her maid, and this is where the 500 a year was important. With the connivance of the Earl, her maid and her sister, they paid the maid's husband, he was still in Dublin, they paid him £50 to go and collect Anastasia by horseback from Loughrea and take her to her mother's residence some miles away. She ran away basically during the night with the maid, and this took some daring and independence of spirits. The two ladies sneaked out. Anastasia left in the clothes she was wearing, and she later sued her husband for her jewels and clothes that she left behind. We actually have copies of letters where she listed them all down, the clothes and jewels she had. She initially went to her mother's house, and she went from there to London. So her husband, as I said, took the aforementioned case against the Earl, and the trial was held in Dublin. Earl Francis did not attend, or he didn't defend. You know, they were so important they didn't feel, we have a prince at the moment who was doing something like that in another jurisdiction. So he didn't feel that he should be attending at all. It was kind of a bit beneath him. This was a fairly racy evidence, as I said in the colourful descriptions. What happened was that Charles Daly won the case and he was awarded £6,228 damages as well as costs. Now, just for the damages alone, that would be €974,235 today. It was more, actually, it was over £1 million, I think, when he had paid the costs as well. Following that, Charles Daly, having won the case, then went to the British Parliament and he asked for a divorce, and that was given to him on the 7th of March 768. The marriage was dissolved, really, of Charles Daly and Anastasia. He was fairly ruthless in this divorce case, as a lot of cases, I suppose, are. He mentioned that any children born after a particular day, the day that she would have met the Earl, he said that any children born after such a day would be deemed a bastard. So we now have the Earl, we have Charles and we have the Earl, and the Earl really is now has to do something to pay this 900,000. So from about 1768, he started to dispose of a number of townlands on a leasehold basis. And firstly, he just sold the leases, and the first one really was to Richard Hare, a wealthy Cork merchant. He was importing and exporting butter to Bristol and to Liverpool, and he had bringing in tea, sugar from Cork to Cork, from Jamaica. So as soon as the divorce went through, immediately after the divorce, following a few days later, the Earl and Countess were married at South Hill in Berkshire. This was a palatial residence that the Earl had rented, and it was one of 5 substantial houses that the couple leased or bought over the following 10 years, each more prestigious and lavishly fitted out than the last. That's the marriage, yeah. Just says who that she was sole survivor, Peter Daly, that was her husband, and her sister's names are on that as well. Right, so I'm going to go through a number of houses now fairly quickly. They got married in England, and now they're going to start buying. They were wealthy, at least on paper, because Lord Kerry had rental income from the 90,000 acres he had in Kerry. But the 90,000 acres were bringing in about the same amount as he was having to pay Charles Daly in the 1 year. He owned property, though, also in Kent and a colliery in Durham. Lady Kerry was, as I said, Anastasia. She owned substantial property in Galway. But, you know, paying this money and also leading an expensive lifestyle and using up the rental of his estates for the year, that wasn't really going to leave him with a lot to be spending on day-to-day life. So from 1769, the letters and bills in the archives reflect the severe financial strain that the Earl was under. It didn't impinge on his way of life. He treated it as just as kind of an awkward distraction. See, living on credit for a lot of the aristocracy was a way of life. And this pair started and they continued a life of extraordinary and reckless extravagance for the next 50 years. Post-dated drafts, late payment, mortgages and bonds, annuities falling due, frantic letters to County Kerry to his new agent requesting rentals, mostly all immediate cash. All are copied and stored in 8 boxes in Paris. And I will explain that that's where I got a lot of this material from. An arrangement was made to lease Kerry House in Moleswood Street. And in 1774, he was galvanized into action to do something about his rentals in Kerry. I'm going to show you some of the houses now first. Well, no, we'll go into Kerry, right? He started to think, he doesn't seem to have, and this was something amazing. Later as we go along, he was very good at knowing what he wanted from each small townland, even in Kerry, in North Kerry. He knew who could pay and who couldn't pay. But prior to this, maybe it was because he wasn't, this probably only happened after he was 21. Before that, it just seemed nobody was collecting anything. And the whole place had got into a mess. But at this point now, when he really wants the money, his first cousin, Dean Crosby of Limerick, recommended that he appoint the Reverend Christopher Julian as his agent. Christopher Julian's father had been the agent for the first and second Earl. He knew the area and he knew the tenants. He lived outside Listowel. He lived in Tullamore outside Listowel, so he was familiar with the area. The Earl didn't seem to have any information at this stage about who owned what. And it's amazing how he got together with, you know, well, you will see as we go along that he was able to say, you know, so in such a townland could pay it, but he won't pay or otherwise. And he maybe he learned it from Christopher Julian as he went along, but it does seem a bit strange. Christopher Julian was honest and hardworking and infinitely patient. There were immediate problems that the previous agent was called Mr. Rice, and it was one of the things I had to struggle with as well, because from the moment the Earl started to get interested in his tenants and in his land and in the money coming in from it, he was following up Mr. Rice, and he was kind of damning him as if somebody who'd run away with money and that. And it took me ages to find him, but anyway, I don't think he was running away with anything. It was just the place wasn't very well run. He was a formidable personage in his own right, and he wasn't a person that Christopher Julian would like pursuing. He was the son of Sir Stephen Rice, a Privy Councillor and Baron of the Irish Exchequer. He had a law degree himself from Trinity, and he was married to a daughter of the 14th Knight of Kerry. He later purchased 40,000 acres in Mount Trenchard, which probably some of you will know, outside Foynes. The litigation between the Earl and Mr. Rice went on for years and years. There was always, every matter what happened or where they went or what they did, there was always litigation with somebody kind of going on in the background. So we'll go back to the Earl and Countess now are in England, and they started to go and rent houses and sometimes buy houses. And they stayed in England, in both London and Bath, but every year they went to France, and then every year then they also went to Spa in Belgium to take the waters. And they really liked that because that's where they met the crowned heads of Europe doing the same, taking the waters. Right, so we'll go through the houses. This is one of them. He was in Portman Square. This was Prior Park and Bath. So you can see they're huge mansions. This now, even while they had Prior Park, it was outside Bath. He also took in, these were new houses at the time, the Circle in Bath. He took that as a townhouse because you could have people calling an Anastasia, or you might have somebody for afternoon tea. Whereas the other house, the bigger house, you could have balls and you could have theatricals and stuff there. Now you can beginning to wonder like about the amounts of money that are being used at this stage. This was the kind of furniture that they had. The Adams brothers were employed to make the furniture, and the furniture he had in all these houses, like each one was better than the next, and a lot of them are in British museums at the moment. It's possible to find them. This would be one of the, he'd up and go then, he might be there 3 years and he'd go to the next one, a finer house again. This was the auction at Prior Park in Bath. He would be selling the silk, damask, china, the lanterns, his wagons, hay even, billiard tables, chairs, sofas, everything. And he'd start off with a new lot again. Now, this was the last house they had in London. And he was drawing up plans and getting Robert Adam, a very expensive architect again, to draw up a plan for what would really be the final one and the one that would stand out most. And it was to be called Kerry House. He would get a cost for it he wasn't like Dermot Bannon, I'm afraid, because he'd get a cost from Robert Adam, and he wouldn't go back saying, no, he wanted money taken off it. He'd go back and say he wanted another wing put on or something else, some other embellishment. So the cost would be going up and up. These homes, there were backgrounds really to entertaining, I think. This never got built because now things are starting to really tighten up. And all the homes were backgrounds to entertaining and impressing. But it seems that the London aristocrats were not really impressed. you have to ask yourself at this point, like, what was the reason that all this buying and all this entertaining and everything was going on? There were probably two things in my view. One was that he wanted Anastasia and himself to be recognized as, you know, an upstanding couple, much admired, much looked up to. But he wasn't getting that at all. And that's why probably why he left Dublin and went to London in the first place. But he wasn't getting it. You know, people in London weren't inclined. They liked Anastasia and she seemed to have been popular enough, but they weren't really accepting her as somebody that they should be looking up to. So he wasn't making the mark that he would like to make in the social scene. And the second reason, I think myself as well, was that he was vying with his first cousin, William Petty Fitzmaurice, the Earl of Shelburne, later called Lord Lansdowne. He was vying with him to be better than him. And he really couldn't afford that because the Lansdownes had a lot more money than them. And even they were starting to kind of run out of money. They were building so many things. Lord Lansdowne had built a big house in Berkeley Square, Lansdowne House. It was in Berkeley. It was also designed by Robert Adams. And of course, they had the big stately home in Bowood. So I think that's why they were trying to do all this work. Now, this is Anastasia was presented at court, and this was big because George III didn't always allow divorced people to be presented at court, but they were able to swing that one all right. And even the newspaper here says that the Earl and Countess were introduced to their majesties and most graciously received, and their equipage and retinue on this occasion was particularly elegant and splendid. The jewels worn by the Countess were estimated at how many thousand. I can't see it at the side here because the pictures are on it, but this was printed in the Oxford Journal on the 4th of March 1769. Now I'm going to go to yes, sorry, this was one of the things that was coming against them, that why they couldn't kind of respectabilize themselves enough. Okay, there were little, and I was able to find these when I went researching. Every little small town in England had a newspaper. It might only be 3 or 4 pages, but they all had newspapers, and they were all, you know, vying for news to put in them. So if one of them put something in, it seemed to be in all of them. And there was something called the Sixpenny Journal, for instance. And as I said, look, it was published in all these newspapers here, Kent, Reading, Leeds, everywhere, Newcastle. And in this particular one, it was called something about fornication. And in it, it's the whole story of the court case and the petticoats and the breeches and everything, all that. The story of the court case was in that. Well, now that wasn't very good for somebody that was trying to raise their profile in the British aristocracy of the time. So that was kind of coming against them. Furthermore, as I said, there was a problem with trying to keep money flowing from Lexna. So the next thing that happened then was, I'm going to go to Lexna now. So while all this was going on, they went to Paris, basically. They went from London to Paris when they didn't get the Kerry house built. And in Paris, there are 8 boxes of documents, letters, bills, deeds, all kinds of things to do with the Earls, belong to the Earl. And a lot of them have copies of letters. He must have had a secretary or had a man writing out these copies of all of them, because there were letters from Paris and they were sent to Lexna. And in turn, there were letters sent by Christopher Julian from Lexna to Paris. Now, in 1777, I don't know what the post was like, but you often found that the Earl would be writing something, great idea from Paris, and it must have taken some time to get the letters from one place to the other, because the Earl would get a notion to do something and he'd write a letter to Christopher Julian, maybe instructions, but by the time that Christopher Julian would have come back with a reply, the Earl would have changed his mind. So basically, this is a memorandum of the letters in this particular year. So it brings a lot of different things into it. They basically reflect the severe financial strain that impacted negatively on Lord Kerry from 1768 onwards. There's letters to bankers and to any source who might be able to arrange a loan, temporary or otherwise. Now, the letters, so I'm going to read them. Excerpts from the letters. And there's all kinds of things. There's to do with banks, there's to do with tenants, everything. So we have here, Mr. O'Brien was the Earl's solicitor in Dublin, and he's writing saying that Mr. O'Brien shall return to him the original leases which he sent to him of Banna, Baltavin, Pollock, Carahan, Islandine, Kilgulban, Lerrig, Ramadra, Ballinagarish, Coniger, Monument, Coolatosan, Cortinine, Farnadine, and Lexna Domain. And he goes on down that the lands of Listowel shall be let for 1 year only. He called Listowel a farm at this stage. The lands of Listowel shall be let for 1 year only. That the rent, he would get an idea, for instance, of making more money, and it would be maybe that he would change the lease, the terms of the lease. That time it was usually for the lives of three people, 3 persons in a family. But he thought better that if he changed it around some other way, he could get more money in, and then he would write saying that maybe they'll change it. And by the time Christopher Julian would have thought about it and written back, the Earl would have changed his mind again. He says, I am sanguine in hoping to get a considerable increase in income by converting the tenure on all the farms in the 2 leasehold estates into perpetuities, and it will be of great satisfaction to me. And then he has, he was very taken with a few places. And one was the Warden of Banna, as he calls it. He wasn't getting any money there for the moment, but he's trying to get £10 per annum for it. One that really intrigued me was that he had another one here, because it had a person, that Knocklegan or Corricannon are not included therein except at their present rents, as I do not think the tenants would or could pay adequately for them either in rent or fine. So my own ancestors are from Corricannon, and they're Larry Cumpon, but they weren't there at this point now. It would have been the people before them. But it's interesting to see that he could differentiate between the people who could and who couldn't pay. And that was something. Let's see what else now. Yeah, he would, because he was only trying to catch up on it, as it were. This is what it seemed. So he didn't know his lease of 3 lives. He wouldn't know if one of them was dead, if the lease was out. So this was Julian's task. He had to go around and sort all those out and write up new leases, collect the rent. He said here, 2 of these lives are dead. James Gorman, the only surviving life, a hale old man, but turned 70. The farm lies near the town of Ardfert, convenient to manure from the sea, and will sell for more than double the present rent. He had a bit of a pop then at the people in Lexna, because at this point now, as you can imagine, if you abandoned your house, not alone, like a simple house, but if you've abandoned this mansion of a house, never go back near it, nobody looking after it, it starts to go to wreck and ruin. And he says, I cannot conceive why the vagabonds about Lexna should not all be turned off. They certainly prejudiced the letting of the land, and I should be of the opinion to do so this year. If he, that's Julian, has no reason against it, he'll throw them out. There was a very interesting one about the woods. The Earl's grandfather, Francis's grandfather Thomas, had during his life planted orchards and woods on his own domain from a perspective of general improvement on his estate. And there were many other townlands in the wider Fitzmaurice lands, and they were forested. And by 1775, the value of the timber was their prime attraction. And we notice as we go along that when there's a real urge for money, the first thing instructed is to sell forestry, sell land, and or to sell trees and wood. And he did the same thing in this colliery in Durham. I saw an ad in a newspaper where he was selling the wood from the trees there as well. Now he got a great plan. All of a sudden, he got a new plan for Listowel, and he really wanted to get a surveyor, and that it was, as I said, it was farm, but now he's decided he's going to plan the town on a large scale. And he has all kinds of things. He wants the town, which now is a square, he wanted it to be an octagon in the centre, of which the fair may be held and a market house built. And so the way the streets were to be laid out, and he'd keep one house for himself, and each street may consist of houses of different prices, and of course suitable for people of different circumstances. Every person who should choose to come to the town should have the street which best suited his situation. The houses which I would hope will be built will be advertised to be let for 3 lives or 31 years. But if you do not think, he's saying this to Christopher, if you do not think it will be sufficient to let them for the lives of their respective tenants for 21 years, and he goes on at length, big long messages and stories about it, and then at the very, maybe following, before the letter is nearly posted, he changes his mind. He decides he's not going to build in Listowel at all. Sorry. Another flight of fancy he had was that he wouldn't, Christopher Julian was continually asking him to come and visit, because the Earl was very good for going, as I said, to France, and he was going to the spa, and Christopher Julian wanted him to come and just visit Lexna and see the place and see what was happening there, but he just couldn't get him to come at all. And he romanced at one point, even when he knew that the old court was falling down, he romanced at one point that he would build a nice house for himself in Kilconnelly or Bale. But again, that didn't come to anything. Right. No, so we get to Paris. Initially, I think that they went to Paris in 1775, when the Kerry house in London wasn't being built, or there was never going to be built. He took himself to Paris, himself and Anastasia. They took 2 of their own servants with them, and they set themselves up in Paris. Now, I think they probably were going to go maybe for a few months or something, but it ended up that they stayed there. So he started on the house hunting again and going to different things. He leased 4 particular, hotel particular, they called it, one after another. And he also leased a country house at Versailles, where Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI held court. They really had the best addresses in Paris. And one of them now is the British Embassy. Oh, sorry, that's not. So since 1814, it had been, the one that I'm talking about had been the official residence of the ambassador of the United States to France. The Countess established a salon, and these were very fashionable at that time. And maybe this again was another idea he had for kind of promoting Anastasia. You see, he thought so highly of her that he really wanted her to be, as highly thought of. So he established, this Countess established a salon. It was very fashionable. It provided a place for men and women to congregate for intellectual discourse. It was a male-dominated society, so women, usually they were the hostesses. They just served as the hostesses. But in the salons, they could decide the agenda of topics to be discussed, and this is where they became slightly a bit more powerful. Richard Hayes, historian, says that Anastasia had a fashionable salon on the Champs-Élysées, but I couldn't find any evidence of this. She had a salon, but I'm not sure that it was the most fashionable or the smartest or the trendiest. They were always run by the leading society ladies of the court. Usually they were mistresses to the leading politicians of the day at that particular time. 2 other areas where the Earl was particularly interested himself was that supper was served, and it was always a luxurious. You needed to have a luxurious and impressive background, something like I have here. And this is where the Earl was interested in. He was into everything, like what kind of food they'd have, and again, the kind of furniture, and we start up with the whole rigmarole of starting to get the different best quality furniture and furnishing places. So they then, what I have then to show for the following years were that he started this, they were spending at a great rate, they were living in these palatial places, they bought the best of clothes, they bought the best of paintings, books, and in these boxes of, in the archives in France, there were hundreds, absolutely hundreds of copies of billheads. Again, these are all very interesting because they're obviously written in French, but they are billheads from the 1700s. and they're either receipts or billheads for paintings, books, bookbinding, opera glasses, wigs, jewellery, expensive clothes and linen. They were renting stables and horses and catering bills. They had big catering bills and they had wages. Now I'm going to show you some of these. These would be perfume receipts, just perfume alone. 1788. This particular one was furniture and upholstery. Nothing would be paid for straight away, like it mightn't be. That was 55,000 for the furniture and upholstery at that point in 1777. Wine, and it was best of Bordeaux, obviously, was bought, and these would all be listed down on the times that they were having whatever the soirees that they were having, the dinners, and they had the opera in some of the houses, put on an opera. They had wines, chocolate, Italian party, English cheese, all kinds of stuff that cost a lot of money. And these were all available in Paris at that time in 1783. Now, this is my Lord's tailor, and there was a huge amount of bills for different kinds of garments that they wore then. They were obviously socializing in Versailles with Marie Antoinette and her husband, and there were very specific things that you had to wear. It wasn't like you turned up in a particular, you had to wear very specific outfits to be going there. So they kind of they went themselves and patronized the tailors that or the dressmakers that both the king and Marie Antoinette used. Now he was very into bookbinding, and it's a pity that when you'll see at the end when he had to leave all of a shot, where did all these books go to? He was also in very much collecting paintings, and I'm going to show you a painting at some stage of that has turned up in the last couple of months, a month or so, which must have been distributed. It was found in Vienna. Now, this is my Lady Kerry, and these were bills for dresses. Now, Madame Berton, she was the dressmaker to the Queen, and you see a lot of this on top, that they were appointed by the Queen, or they were appointed by the King, and these were dresses. Now, you see that the bills were for 2 years, dresses for 1783 to 1785. She didn't pay regularly. I suppose they paid when the money came in, and other times they didn't pay at all. Right, so they rented stables and horses, and they had a huge number of people working for them as well. Now, in 1776, he was on a trip to Montpellier, and he is starting now to sell outright. Before this, he was looking, as I said, he had Hare, who was offered to sell him leasehold, but now he was wanting to sell outright. So in 1776, he's writing to the Earl, to Hare, and he wants to sell him outright 3 farms, but he's also looking for a loan of £8,000. Now, this is 1.5 million at the moment, okay? And he started negotiating with Hare. Wasn't inclined to do this. Hare told him that he wouldn't buy any more leaseholds, he would only buy outright. So he was forced to kind of talk to him about outright then. And he started negotiating with 1778 with Hare, and he eventually sold to him. He eventually sold to him, and Hare got all that in those towns, lands and premises of Banna, Baltoven again, Kilgolban, Lissadog and Lerrig, all of which said towns and lands are situated lying in Bingham, County Kerry. But it took until 1783 because they haggled. A lot of the stuff was, bank had a lien on it. You know, there were always some kind of legalities that took ages for everything to sell. But in 1783, finally, after much haggling, the Earl sold to Richard Hare the vast majority of the remaining Fitzmaurice patrimony. Unusually now, he appears to have made a good deal with Hare, because for the manors, castles, markets, fairs, towns, he sold everything. Fairs, the towns, crossing of the Cashin River, for instance, lands, tenemented and hereditaments. The Earl was to receive the sum of 13,900. Now, that's just 2,500,000 to us at the moment. But he was also to be paid a yearly annuity of £3,000 a year from Hare as long as he lived. And if the Earl should die before the Countess, she was to get an annuity of 2,000 a year for her lifetime. And he was also to pay annuities to unnamed persons. He didn't name them, of 300 and 500. But these were the annuities that he had started when he was 22 to his son, Richard Dudley Fitzmaurice, and to his mother. He was to pay these to them every year. Edward Hare was to pay them. In 1783, he also disposed of land to Locks of Norbury. And again, it took ages to sell anything because there'd be litigation between them. What he had decided he'd sell them, when the deeds would come, it wouldn't be the right, you know, it might be different townlands that were in it. Everything took ages to you know, because there was missing deeds, properties were tied up in mortgages to other people, and nothing really was simple. As you can see here, this was probably just a letter, you know, that he wrote again after as he was writing it there. This is to do with Kifinuge and Ballyhorgan, some other parts of them that he was selling. So we go along. So he's in Paris. He's enjoying a great life. The money is coming in. He's now sold. He you know, at one point he didn't pay Francis Dudley's 300 at all, and the mother wrote Elizabeth Chambers to him and kind of remonstrated with him that you know, she needed the money, and he told her that he was a bit short at the moment, but a very big sum would be coming in soon, and that was the money from Hare, which did come in eventually. So in 1783, this is his first cousin now, William Petty Fitzmaurice. This is the son of his uncle John, who had taken the action against him one time. And he has now become the Prime Minister of England. And the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the delegation at that time included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, a lot of those people had come from America to sign the treaty. And so they were the center of attention. They would have visits from these people, from his cousin, from the different American people who came to negotiate and sign the treaty as well. And this is very important, really, I suppose, in the history of the Fitzmaurices, of the Petty Fitzmaurice, that one of them was a signatory to the treaty, to the United States at the Treaty of Paris, the freedom. Yeah. Now, they're conducting their life in the same way they always did. They had brought their carriage with them from England. It was especially made, coach and four, and every day they went down the Champs-Élysées with powdered and wigged footmen. On the side of the carriage, which I'll show you soon, it had the arms of the Kerry arms, it was called, the Fitzmaurice Kerry arms. So they were very, you know, people would see these two coming along, and on a regular basis every day. But they're not taking any interest in what's going on around them, and because they don't see themselves as having anything to do, I suppose they were like Mary Antoinette, they were keeping their heads well down. But after as well as the people that they were entertaining, there were a number of people of Kerry residents in Paris at the time. And some of those had left with King James after the Treaty of Limerick. They would have been descendants of theirs. And they had left because they didn't see a future in Ireland. And their families were there now. And some of them had banks, they had good businesses. There were the Rices, the Waters, the Dillons, Daniel Charles O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell's uncle was there. So the Earl and Countess kept a large staff, and there are a number of documents in the archives showing the names and wages of the staff for the month of April 1790, and it was 4,200 livres, or 3,094 pounds, which was a lot of money for 1 month in the month of August. The main person there, the person who got the most money, was called Madam Spriggs. She was out the lady's maid, Anastasia's lady's maid, and she had come originally from London with them. And I noticed that on some occasions, when he couldn't pay the wages, Madam Spriggs would give him a loan. She was the lady's maid. She would give him a loan, but he would pay it back then when the money came in again. this is the storming of the Bastille. Then after the fall of the monarchy, they still stuck it out, and after the fall of the monarchy and the imprisonment of the king, the Earl then started to get nervous, and he decided maybe it was time to go. This was his carriage, or this was the coat of arms on the carriage. The Fitzmaurice colours, and that was very, you can imagine seeing this on a big black carriage going up and down the Champs-Élysées. You know, if it's very easy to see who was in it. After the fall of the monarchy, though, they decided maybe they better leave, and they were alarmed really because it began to come to their front doors. It wasn't the poor people who couldn't have bread or who were on the street. It was the aristocracy themselves were being massacred. And in particular, there was a friend of Anastasia's who was also a friend of Marie Antoinette's. She was the Princess de Lamballe. She was executed. And there is note saying that they had been inside their drawing room window when her head passed by on a pike. So they really decided they better get out. But they had left it very late. And at this time, it was announced that they needed a passport as well. But the British embassy had in fact packed up and left, and they found it very difficult. They never got a passport. They had really left it too late. They left it in a great hurry, unable to take their servants except Madame Spriggs, and she went with them. And they were unable to take their carriage because everybody would know what it was. A few days after their departure, they couldn't, because they didn't have a passport, they actually went to Brussels. They couldn't get out of France. They initially went to Brussels. A few days after his departure, the Department of Paris placed seals on his papers and effects an inventory, and they did an inventory of his furniture. And in the following October, in accordance with the decree sequestering the property of subjects of countries at war with France, as England now was at war with them, all this stuff was ordered to be sold. His silver was sent to the mint. His two servants, who were on that list of people who were to be paid the money in April earlier, his two servants' names were tried on charges of espionage, and they were guillotined. So as I said, he went firstly to France, as he was sure, he thought, like everything, like I suppose, like current day, he thought that Paris would return to normal fairly quickly and he would get back to his property. But this was not to be. So he was, I think, a year there, and then he eventually went back to London and he took a house in Tal Mal. Within 4 years of that, Anastasia died, and she's buried in Westminster Abbey in the chapel of St. Andrew. This is a picture or a photograph I took myself, so it wouldn't be the most professional. In the chapel of St. Andrew, she's in the same enclosure that surrounds the royal tombs in the St. Henry VII chapel. A visitor from Kerry in I've seen this in the Kerry Evening Post, a visitor from Kerry in 1900 reported that one of the vergers in the cathedral told him that only there are 4 instances where remains were interred in cenotaphs over the floor. And the 4 people in the Westminster Abbey are Edward the Confessor, Henry III, Edward I, and the Earl of Kerry. But this is Anastasia at this point. He's not buried there yet. He was devoted to her all of the time, and he was devastated when she died. And according to the papers again, he used to go there every day to pray at her tomb. Now, when Anastasia was in Paris, she actually had a Catholic abbey as her chaplain. But here now, she's in the Protestant Westminster Abbey. He's kind of lost the will, if you like, at that when he got back. He didn't lose the will to get into litigation, but he got lost the will to be going around and promoting himself and having entertainments and stuff. And in 1807, he resigned as governor of Kerry. He spent his remaining years pursuing his claims on the French government. He was not averse to reminding Prime Minister Pitt that he was, as he stated about himself, he said his peerage was one of 618 years, and he was nearly the oldest peer in the King's dominion. He had a number of court cases, and he died himself at Hampton Court Green. The direct line of the Fitzmaurice family became extinct. Now, it was a pity, really. He was lazy and indulgent. You know, he had things going for him, but he was lazy and indulgent. When he died, he wanted to be buried in the same coffin. Now, I don't know if this really happened, but that's supposed to be what happened. In death, there's a new, go back to this, there's a mark, on this it's noted, in death they were not divided. And it just says Francis Thomas, Earl of Kerry, died July the 24th, 1818, aged 78 years. So with him, the direct line of the Fitzmaurice family became extinct. His estate then passed to his cousin, who at that point was Henry Petty Fitzmaurice, 3rd Lord Lansdowne. And that man became the 24th Lord of Kerry and Exile, and the 4th Earl of Kerry. He didn't have much to leave, but he had property in the Diocese of Canterbury, and he had a coal mine in Durham. And while the coal mine didn't bring him in much money in his own lifetime, it was very valuable after he died, because the Industrial Revolution had come in England, and coal was obviously very highly valued. He had taken an action against the French government, and that was eventually settled, but it wasn't settled it was settled maybe 5 years after he died, and they got 145,000 francs for that. Now, these are where the, Charlie, who's there at present in Lansdowne? The Lansdownes at the moment in Bowood is a man called Charlie Lansdowne. He has written a foreword to the book, and they are very interested in knowing more about Lixna and more about their heritage. The things that I regret about Francis's laziness, as it well, in his spendthrift ways, were what happened later, because when the Fitzmaurices were there, I haven't got too much any kind of bad vibes that they were very bad landlords. They were always, they weren't absent for a start. Well, until he came along, they weren't absent. And they also were regarded as kind of one of us. You know, they were there like so long. Whereas when he sold on, the new landlords really were, first of all, they were absent. They were always living, they were either living in England. In Hare's case, he was living in Cork most of the time, or in London. But they were also employed agents, and these agents caused a lot of trouble in the later centuries, particularly around the time of the famine, in evicting people and ejecting people. And I just think that, you know, it's a pity that that happened, that we weren't able to hold on to the Fitzmaurices as the actual landlords. It also changed the balance of power in Kerry, in that what were the powerful people in North Kerry were now the powerful people in South Kerry. And they were the Lansdowne's estates. They had the estates in the Beara Peninsula and around Kinmayer. The two things that I want to say just before we finish is that I recommend for people who want to learn more, I'd recommend the Journal of the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society, Series 2, Volume 10, 2010. That's that one. And also, I would recommend to anyone who wants to more about the Fitzmaurices back in the 1500s and the 1600s, Martin Moore's book. It's called Deeds, Not Words. And that's a much more academic book, and it's very interesting, and there's a huge amount of research gone into it. So if you wanted to go back further, that's what I think we should do. What's next? Yes, I just want to show you, this is where it's amazing, really, and I think people didn't realize it. I certainly didn't until I started doing the research here, that all this material about Kerry, about tenants, they're named on the documents. Tenants that were there in North Kerry, particularly in Clanmorris, again, some in Oireachta Connor, in the 1700s, like as who was paying the rent, how much they were paying. All that are in boxes, 8 boxes, in the National Archives of France in Paris. They're not archived in a way like that they're all one after another. They're higgledy-piggledy. You could get two of them, two documents, and it would be maybe bills for wigs or perfume or something, and the next document would be a tenant book. So there's a lot of work, but it is there, and I think it'd be ideal for some young person who really wanted to do an in-depth, you know, look into particularly into the land issues, because there are farmers in North Kerry, quite a lot of them, are descended from the people that were there then and that were the subjects of these Earls of Kerry. That's it. That's the book, and that's where it's there. We've very little left. I think there's only, I don't know whether these bookshops have the book or not, but some of them probably still have one or two. Okay, thank you. Sorry, did I go over?
Oh no, that's fascinating, Kate. Thank you so much. I'm just going to stop the recording. Just